The United States is a melting pot made up of all types of people.
But when it comes to the U.S. Census, the country's official population tally, not everyone's on the list. Today on The Stream, we discuss the importance of being counted.
Right now, the United States Census Bureau is finalizing what questions will be included in the 2020 census, and not everyone made the cut. The agency recently announced it will not ask people about their sexual orientation or gender identity.
The LGBT community isn't the first minority group to be left off the survey. Arab Americans have never been included. In the past, they were forced to check white or other. But this year, the census may add a new MENA category for people of Middle Eastern or North African descent. It's a welcome addition for those who say they felt the sting of exclusion. Others fear the label will only open them up to government scrutiny.
So what are the political and social implications of being excluded from the US Census? Here in our studio to talk about this, we have Maya Berry. She's the Executive Director of the Arab American Institute. In New York, Kenneth Pruitt. He's a former director of the US Census Bureau and now professor at Columbia University. Also in New York, Ben Castleman. He's the senior editor and chief economic writer for 538. That's a website focused on political analysis. And in Sacramento, California, Jose Plaza. He's the president of the Latino GLBT History Project. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Maya, when you see a little box describing your either racial or your ethnic background, what are you looking to tick?
It's real estate on a form that allows us to be counted and represented. So whenever you've looked at the form, you simply fill it out by checking out which one is most closely identified to how you relate. Yeah. And for the longest time, as you correctly pointed out, there simply hasn't been a category there for us. So we've been working on this, dare I say, for over 3 decades. And it's exciting to finally get to the point where it's been tested in the field and we're getting close to having it in the 2020 census.
Right. I mean, Kenneth, when people look at boxes and they're ticking the census, there's so much more involved in that in terms of passion and identity. Can you explain, from your experience when you were heading the Census Bureau, what it was that people were talking to you about, why it mattered?
Certainly. What Maya just said is really a very recent development in the census. We did not, in the 19th, 20th century, early 20th century, think that the purpose of the census was self-expression, was to express one's identity, to be included. That's a very new vocabulary for the census, and it is only about 20 or 30 years old. And of course, it's the kind of conversation that has momentum. Some groups say, well, I want to be there, then why not other groups? And why not other groups? How many groups should there be? If you really asked everyone what their real specific trait was, we might have to have a census with 320 million options.
You know, if I may just on that point, to be clear, it's not that I'm suggesting a government could give us our identity. Our identity is something that is within us. My point is that it allows us to have a box to accurately arrive at data to better collect that information about us. Because you're absolutely right, that's a very different thing than counting the number of Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to jump in here just quickly and note that this is a conversation that's been going on for a really long time. I came across an editorial in the New York Times from 1909 headlined, "Is the Turk a white man?"
Ooh.
Which is a pretty amazing discussion then
Sure.
of whether we should count at the time Turks as white. So this is a debate that has sort of been going on in kind of how do we count people, how do we categorize people, you know, for basically the entire history of our country.
And as of right now, Maya, maybe you know the answer to this, people of Turkish descent, what do they check?
So based, I believe, and Ken can correct me here, based on the OMB directive, that would be classified as white. But I think the case that Ben is talking about is also interesting in that it's more about dealing with exclusion in terms of immigration. So the case was being made that we don't want to fall under the Asian Exclusionary Act, therefore they make the case that we are white and therefore allow us in. So it's a bit of a apples and oranges in some ways, but it's absolutely complicated.
I love that you said that because that's what I was thinking. This just sounds complicated. So it is complicated, people online are telling us, but this is why it matters. This is a tweet we got from Team Osman, that's the handle, who says it's important to know the characteristics of a population so the government can improve on education, reproductive health, and food security. I want to share with all of our guests a headline that illustrates what this means and what this might look like. This is ProPublica, and this is an investigative report that they recently did. And I'm scrolling down here. Minority neighborhoods pay higher car insurance premiums than white areas with the same risk. And they mention in the report that they got that data using U.S. Census data. So, Jose, can you talk to us, referencing this and that earlier tweet about why it matters? In your perspective, why does this data matter?
Sure. So I think the census, the way that we see it as it's counting Americans. But I actually think it's giving us a perspective of the representation and the diversity of Americans. And so it's not about counting, it's about representing Americans. And so it's important that when we're looking at diversity, we're not looking just at racial and ethnic, but of gender expression, of identity. Because what matters is that the census gives us a count of Americans, but it also impacts funding. It impacts exactly car insurance and the resources that are available to communities. And so it's important to count everybody, but to also represent the diversity within the American household.
Kenneth.
Yeah, I would ask my friends around on this conversation, is there a minimum number of people in a given group that would suggest we shouldn't be counting groups that have 10, 15 people or 2,000 people or 1 million people? Is there a threshold beyond which we shouldn't fall? Because we're not going to have very useful data if there's not enough people to actually make a presence in the census itself. We are counting about 320 million. But we've got category systems are very slippery things.
I would point out that for a time there was an effort to say that we needed an Arab American category, and it's frankly that process, that discussion that got us to say, well, that's not inclusive enough actually. If you do Middle Eastern North African, it allows it to be broader and to capture more of those communities. So I think that's part of the process that we go through to determine that. And the point to be made, frankly, is if we're doing an accurate count, we're going to reflect the diversity that is our country today. That's the point. If we just have to count people accurately, make sure that there's an opportunity for them to find themselves on the form, check that, and you will arrive at who this country is.
Benny,
yeah, and I think we have to, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, you're not. You're our guest. Go ahead.
I think you have to count to be able to find what numbers matter, what numbers have critical masses, because otherwise, we're just assuming that there is only a small percentage of a certain subset of the population.
Jose, give us
without ever knowing we're going to overcome.
Jose, give us an example. You're saying, and Maya's saying, numbers are important because. Give us a concrete example.
Well, looking specifically at the undocumented population, and I know that immigration is a big component. We're hovering between like 11 and 15 million. And the president has given certain figures, but then we have like the Pew Center who gives another number. The census should be the tool to find out these numbers. But if we're not being able to, go into people's homes and find exact figures because of the nature of this population, then who else is going to be counting?
But I would respond quickly on that. The census does not, of course, ask anyone what their citizenship status is. And if we asked their legal status, roughly the 11 million undocumented that we estimate to be in the country would flee. They wouldn't answer the form at all. So we would be at risk of really losing them if we tried to answer the question on the census itself. That I'm really convinced of. There is Republican interest right now in asking that question. I think it's a very damaging development.
So I wanted to share a perspective via video comment that we got from Doha, and then her name is Doha, and then counteract that with some pushback we got via Facebook. So this is from Doha Madani out of New York. Here's what she says.
So it's not just a point of pride as to why there should be a MENA category in the U.S. Census. It's a matter of incorporating policy. We know anecdotally that people from the Middle Eastern and North Africa region are discriminated against in the workplace, in housing, all of these different areas. But without a category to file us under other than white, we cannot statistically track this. And without statistics, we can't incorporate any sort of policy or change or lawsuits.
So she gives a pretty concrete example there of why she thinks people from the Middle East and North Africa should be counted. This is what Naima on Facebook says, though. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, I would say. She says, as for these extra categories, that's a great idea. So that way they know exactly how many yellow stars or crescent moons to order for when it comes time to staple them to your arms. Referencing, of course, horrific history there. Maya, what do you make of this? There is fear there, even though this is tongue-in-cheek, there is a fear that tallying people then leads to dangerous things.
Look, there is fear, and it's a legitimate fear. And just as Ken pointed out, that we've never asked immigration status on a census, we also do not ask faith. The religion question is simply not part of how the census is taken. And I would say that the fear, you can say post-election, the fear has increased, but there are also reasons for why that would be the case. I mean, it is public knowledge that the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, the census data was used in order to target some of those local communities. We had a case in 2004 where some data was shared. What I would say to you, though, even with all that said, the benefits of having accurate data about communities significantly outweighs what I believe to be the risk thus far. So we have worked on this. We continue to work on this. There were guidance put in place after 2004. There are very strong legal violations. If $250,000 violation, I believe, potentially 5 years in prison if you compromise that data. So there are protections in place.
No one has been charged since 1970, so it doesn't actually. The threat is there, but no one's been charged with.
And I think it's quite rare.
Filling out a forced census form.
But, well, the way that the data would be compromised is sort of what I'm talking about. And so I think it's quite rare that that's the case. Yeah. I think the stronger case that your second point could be made is to basically point out that when our government has done the targeting of our communities, it's used publicly available census data, it's used publicly available data, and it's used surveillance programs.
But, I mean, I think that the key thing to sort of understand here, to Maya's point, is that this data provides power, right? There's maybe that risk that it gets misused, but it also provides power to these communities, right? This is the data that allows you or a group like Maya's to call up a congressman and say, hey, look, you have 10,000 people in your constituency who fall into this category, who are MENA, who are, if we end up asking that question at some point, who identify as LGBT, right? This is an ability to gain political power and then to identify the particular issues that affect that group, to be able to say, we know that this is a group that struggles with homelessness, this is a group that struggles with poverty, to then direct programs to those people, to direct government resources to those people. So we have the risk piece of this, but there's also the benefit piece of this, that is where the political power grows out of.
That's exactly right.
I completely agree with that. I think when looking at DACA recipients, which are undocumented child arrivals, there was that fear of, I am giving the government information of my household, of where I live, and post-election, it is a fear that community has of, are they going to come for me because they know where I'm at? But the catch-22 is that we also need that information to have accurate numbers of what, like Ben stated, LGBT populations have some of the highest youth homelessness, transgender murders. All this information we need to have to be able to better make a case for it. And for organizations that are not profit, we are spending money to count ourselves when we should be utilizing the census to do this work for us.
All right, so let me just put this to Ken, because Ken, I know this is an area that you know really well, the practicalities of doing this US Census. Someone comes to your house, they ask your household to complete it. Will they be able to connect, if you put certain sensitive information in that census, will they be able to come and find you? Will the government be able to come and find you?
Well, it certainly the answer to that is yes, and it is a very frightening development. Right now, the census data are very, very carefully protected from that kind of misuse. Even the internment case in Japan was not quite a misuse down to the individual level. What happens, the Census Bureau aggressively appointed the authorities to the neighborhoods. If you're going to round up the Japanese Americans and you go here, you'll find many more of them than if you go there. That was a gross misuse of the census, but it wasn't down to the individual level. You're now describing individual identities. That would be a huge, huge shift for this country of enormous consequences. It takes us to what happened in Nazi Germany and in other countries like the Netherlands and so forth. let me just say that everything that's been said is correct on both sides of this argument. There's no doubt that what the census, up until about the 1990s, the Civil Rights Movement, was basically used to exclude, to penalize, to prohibit, to discriminate in jobs, in education, and across the entire social system. And with the Civil Rights Movement, the census became a force for inclusion, contesting discrimination very successfully. But now we're at a different moment where we now have to look at a threat we really did not imagine we might have.
And I think it's important here to hit quickly on the funding piece of this, because we know that when the census misses people, when it fails to count people, it doesn't do so randomly, right? That it fails to count people who are hard to count, people who tend to be poor, people who tend to be less likely to speak English, people who are homeless or who live in, move a lot from house to house. If we want to make sure that the census reaches everybody, and especially that it reaches some of our most vulnerable populations, it has to have the funding to do that. And so when we talk about concerns about security, we also have to talk here about concerns about funding and losing the funding necessary to conduct an accurate census.
Let me just share this with you, guests. This is from the Arab American Institute, making sure Arab Americans count, adding a MENA category to the census. This didn't just happen in the last year or so. This is a campaign. What does it take, Maya, to influence what the US Census adds in terms of a box?
We started on this campaign in 1985, to give you a sense of it. At the founding of the Institute, we've been working on this issue. It's changed in some ways in terms of how we've come to where we are now. But the decennial census was done in 2010. First meetings for the MENA category began in 2011. And there's been a broad coalition of groups. It's called the MENA Advocacy Group. It includes Arab Americans, Iranian Americans, Turks, and Sunnis.
Is it a political campaign? Are you saying to your lawmakers, we want you to pressurize? Or how do you engage with the Census Bureau?
The good news in this is that the Census Bureau has been a great partner in this process. Right. They admit there is a massive undercount of these communities. Wow. It's literally why we've arrived to the point where we're this close to getting the category. They know that there's a massive undercount. They estimate our community, Arab Americans specifically, to be just under 2 million. We think it's roughly 3.7. So in order to get to a better place, and you know, Ben was highlighting some important pieces of this. We specifically do political empowerment and civic engagement. So one of the things we do every election cycle is completely nonpartisan GOTV work. To Kent's point, we go into those areas based on our highest demographics. So I have 12 key states that we work in. That's how do we arrive at that? That's census data. When we need to know, is there language access ballot issues in those particular precincts? How do I know that? I need to have census data to tell me, is this a predominantly English-speaking community or perhaps a predominantly Arabic-speaking community? Those are the kinds of everyday ways in which it's impacted. School, Department of Education protections. One of the biggest areas for our community is health research. I mean, people don't think about census data relating to health research. We think there's a prevalence of diabetes in our community. Our research are telling us, I know the number of Arab Americans that may have died from diabetes, but I don't have the denominator. I don't know what to compare that with. That's the importance of census data.
So bridging what you said, and Ben, what you mentioned earlier about when the census misses people, we're hearing from some groups, namely those of the LGBT community, who say they could be part of that group of missing. So this is a piece that, Ben, you put out not too long ago. Why won't the census ask about sexual orientation? It's here on my laptop. We got an answer to that question because groups are calling for this, and there was discussion that it might show up on the census. That has since been denied of sorts. Shogani on Twitter says, well, it's because it's none of their business, meaning the government. But this is a tweet we got from someone else, and Jose, I'll address this to you. McDrea says, without census data on LGBTQ population, public erasure and dismissal is probable. Programs for at-risk populations may be cut, violence stats, etc. Jose, can you talk to us, elaborate on what this could mean for those communities, to have it on the census or not to have it on the census?
I mean, erasure is a code word. Because by not counting or not putting effort into counting these vulnerable and disenfranchised populations, you're completely erasing experiences that LGBT individuals are having. The rate of homelessness was brought up. The access to healthcare was brought up. And if we're just assuming that based on ethnicity, we have enough information, but there are disparities that the LGBT community is facing. And then you add on other labels like transgender and documented. We're missing on a lot of information that nonprofits could fund, that local governments could look into to fund. Political campaigns could then utilize to be able to mobilize certain targets for candidates and for policy platforms. And so erasure is key, but more important, representation matters. And it's important to represent the diversity within these groups, because by doing so, you're going to find out the inequities in the services that they're trying to access but are not.
Ken, I have a quote here from John Thompson. He's the current director of the US Census Bureau, and he says, in order for a subject to be included, there must be a clear statutory or regulatory need for data. Does sexual orientation fit that need?
I think in terms of what was just said, it does. If there really could be documented instances of systematic discrimination, that then becomes a policy question that has to be addressed. What John is saying correctly, that he needs pressure from agencies who care about these things. That is, if we didn't have good data in differential health impacts and so forth, then it's going to be hard for the Census Bureau to make the case. If you could make the case that there are differential health impacts or education impacts or susceptibility to violence, then it's much, much easier for the Census Bureau to try to be responsive. The Census Bureau itself does not decide who and how to count. The Congress is really in charge, but the Congress is responding to public pressure. I want to just quickly remind us all that it took a long time to get the Mark I or more, that is the multiple race option, onto the census. The 2000 census, the one I directed, was the first time we really were using that. And again, it had a long history of almost 3 decades before it happened. That's a very fast-growing population, as we know. We're getting much, much more multiple race people. At a certain point, that's going to be one of the largest categories on the census form.
I do want to jump in quickly to Ken's point there about the need for pressure from agencies. We did see some of that last year. We saw the Secretary of Health and of Housing and Urban Development actually wrote to the Census Bureau and said, we need this data in order to carry out our programs effectively. 75 members of Congress, more than 75 members of Congress, wrote in saying the same. There were a couple of other agencies. So there has been some pressure building from within the government to ask for this information. Then, of course, we've seen it from some of these outside advocacy groups as well. Obviously, that pressure sort of wasn't enough to get it over the hump for this time. And the question I think a lot of groups are asking is whether that was because the census kind of on its own determined that wasn't necessary, or whether this is something that there might have been some pressure applied from the new administration. I don't think there's any strong evidence to back that right now, but it's certainly a question that people are asking.
Kenneth, I wanted to pose this to you because this is an interesting experience from women voters. She says, I volunteered a county committee where we've developed a plan for outreach to ensure people were counted, with an emphasis on veterans, the mentally ill, and homeless families, homeless youth. She goes on to say it was a success. The data that she collected didn't go on deaf ears. Legislation was written at the state level to address homeless, abused youth, LGBT, aged out youth, and more. So a success story there, but it seems like it might be quite difficult to find those groups that she mentioned, especially the homeless. What are ways to work around that, and how do you make sure that they're counted as well?
Yes, I want to go back to the issue that that Ben raised. This census right now is very underfunded. That means we will not count in 2020 everybody in the country, and the groups that will be left out are those who are harder to find, as was said, don't speak English, are poverty, don't have access to the internet, don't have phones, don't have neighbors, they're loners, they rent, they're mobile. There's a lot of reasons why it's very hard to count people, and they tend to be people who are at the margins of society. And it takes a huge amount of money to find every one of them and count them in the right place at the right time and so forth. And we have a census that is extremely underfunded. We're not testing all the processes we ought to be testing, and that bodes very poorly for the 2020 census. Right. It is not the fault of the Census Bureau. They're fighting for funds. It's really a judgment that maybe these data aren't worth the effort or worth the cost.
Okay.
And that's a political judgment, not a Census Bureau judgment.
All right, Kenneth Pruitt is a former director of the U.S. Census Bureau. We also have Maya Berry, Ben Castleman, and Jose Plaza in our conversation. And you hopefully go online to stream.aljazeera.com online. We've been talking about the 2020 U.S. Census. Let's end here on my laptop. This is the 1800 census. It included free white males, free white females, and slaves. How things have changed. Hello, this is our online post show. We're discussing the importance of being counted in the US Census. If you were here for our pre-show, you would have heard little stories from all of our guests about their census experience. I would love all of our guests to give us a little takeaway as to what is important coming up for the 2020 census. If you're in the States or you're reading about it elsewhere, what should we keep in mind? Your takeaway, Maya, is, do you think there will be a MENA box?
I do think there'll be a MENA box. I do, and I think it's important that it reflects the diversity of our community. So it's not going to. We've advocated that it be a box for identifying an ethnicity, not to a racial category. There are members of our community who identify as Black, members who identify as white, or no other race. So there's a full range of that. I do think we'll get there. The sort of political situation we're talking about, I'm not sure that everybody will want to fill it out given the political climate, but I really do think we'll sort of get there. And I actually think the point we ended on that Ken was making is an important one. There is not sufficient funding in the lead-up campaigns that always happen to push this out into the community and get accurate counts. And there's certainly, I don't think, going to be enough funding for the people in the field that have to arrive at the difficult-to-get populations. So it'll be a challenge.
Ben, what do you want to remember from your contribution to our show today?
I mean, I think the key thing here that I worry about is that this becomes somehow a partisan or politicized issue. You know, the Census Bureau works very hard, I think, to not be seen as a partisan actor, to make sure that the data is collected in a fair manner, and then it's up to people in Congress and in the White House and state houses across the country to use that data however they see fit. I think it would be a real loss for the quality of the data and you know, ultimately for our democracy if we lose that sense of independent data. And I hope that we don't see that.
Jose.
For me, the conversation was actually quite lively, but also disheartening that politics once again plays a role in the representation of disenfranchised communities. And it is quite unfortunate that, you know, the 2020 census might be funded at the 2010 level, because just as we're using these funding levels that are going to be a decade old, that means we have to rely on the information that is also a decade old. And it's unfortunate for the communities that I represent that there's fear of coming out and being counted and being represented for what politics might end up doing to them. And so it's a scary place to be in right now.
Kenneth, it's been really fascinating having you all talk about the US Census. I never thought it was as interesting as you all made it. Kenneth, that's a revelation on my part here. Kenneth, what's your takeaway for us if we head towards this next big census in the US?
Yes, it's a depressing one. It goes as follows. If you track the blog post on what they sometimes call the alt-right, there are deep concerns that their country, that is a European descendant country, has been taken away from them. And the census is the evidence that it's been taken away from them, because the Census Bureau sometimes references majority-minority, which is to say at a certain point there'll be more minorities in the country than there are white people or Europeans. And that is now a fundamental part of the politics of this country. As you get strong arguments about immigration, about sending people back home, and so forth and so on. That is in part driven by we, the whites, are about to be a minority in our own country. We own this country, it's being taken away from us. This, I think, is the most pernicious, this is the most damaging, this is the most frightening part of the current conversation emerging around the census. And just a footnote on that, by definition, if we have a MENA category, which I think we should have, it will reduce white votes, because the Arab Americans who otherwise would have been in the European category will now be out of that category and in effect part of a minority. That's also true, by the way, of the blacks, some of them, Sudanese, Somalia, will naturally migrate out of their black population group to the MENA group. But the impact will mainly be felt on the white count, and that is going to simply deepen the anger. We have to live with that. We have to fight it. It's not a reason not to do the question, but we have to know that's one of the consequences.
That's only the case if the question is posed as a racial question, and that is not what we're advocating for. We're asking for an ethnic category where people can choose whatever race they want.
You can be black
well,
and
I'm
black.
Maya, who's really has deep expertise in this, as she knows, I really wish we weren't even using the word race, period, in the census, which is what group do you belong to and so forth. However, the way it plays out, Maya, on the blog post, they won't make that fine distinction. They're going to say, this is a lot of minority races agitating for more benefits, taking them away from us, and we want our country back.
On that note.
Right, exactly. On that note, I will end with these two tweets because
that's the silence of people quietly crying inside.
Though I will say, Kenneth, that I think our majority of our community agrees with you spot on in your analysis of what will happen after we get those results from the 2020 census. This is Dr. Shanda, and she says this is the reason we have to do it. Not collecting the data is the best way to hide problems. And one more person, this is Dr. Arif, who says we may exist on the quote-unquote security radar, but our community's needs are ignored due in part to low count. National mobilization must start now.
Thank you so much, guests. I am going to leave you with a little PSA from Iranican. They are a not-for-profit group helping educate Iranians about how to complete their 2020 census. Have a look at this.
I'm from the U.S. Census Bureau.
Oh, yes, I've heard of the census.
And I'm here because you didn't fill out your forms.
I'm sorry, I was very busy.
So I'm going to talk you through the questions, and when I get to the question about race, I suggest you tell me to write Iranian American or Iranian.
Is there a box for Iranian American?
No, there's no box, but I will check other and then write in Iranian American.
But we are white, just put white. There's a box for white.
Technically that's true, but that's not going to help us be counted.
Oh, is there benefit?
Potentially gives Iranians minority status.
All right, I will leave you with that little smile as we look ahead to the 2020 US Census. Thanks everybody for being part of the stream today. Take care.